Good afternoon. My name is Josef Shima. I'm the president of the Prague Conference on Political Economy and also president of this college, CEVRO Institut. I'm excited to have an opportunity to welcome you here in Prague, in the center of Europe, and hope that the 2 days of our conference will be a great intellectual adventure for all of us. As those of you who have attended PCPE in the past can easily figure out, we moved the venue of the conference to this beautiful building. The reason is that starting last September, I have become the president of this private college, the CEVRO Institut, and because we host the whole event, let me share with you a couple of seconds about the school as such so that you know where we are. The CEVRO Institut College got started 4 years ago as a project founded by existing think tank, free market / conservative classical liberal think tank, whose founding fathers decided that it is actually needed to expand a little bit. They understood very well that the battle is in the field of ideas and that you have to approach public to have some influence over the public debate. However, think tanks are good, but to have a real school that would systematically produce students, professionals in fields such as private law, public law, economics, political science, international relations, is actually something that we believe can make a real difference. The college offers standard BA and MA programs, but is very unique in one way, and that is that it is explicitly free market, classical liberal, conservative in a good sense. And I'm proud that I can be here to be part of this exciting project and help to bring a little bit more economics to the school, which started as not a law school, but school where legal disciplines were taught and some political science was taught. So this is where we are, and I believe there is a great future for this institution. Now, back to the conference as such. Prague Conference on Political Economy, organized since 2005, has become a traditional annual meeting of scholars working in the tradition of the Austrian economics and Austrian-friendly fields of social research. Simply, I'm glad to welcome here all of you who understand that economics is not a fancy playground of artificial model builders and for artificial model builders, but a science which deals with real people in the real world. It is a very practical science whose understanding is crucial for social flourishing. As Ludwig von Mises, at the very last page of his book Human Action, stated, the body of economic knowledge is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which its knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard the teaching and warnings, they will not annul economics, they will stamp out society and the human race. I'm very happy that social scientists from all over the world, not just economists indeed, keep coming to this event organized jointly by the CEVRO Institut College, Faculty of Economics and Public Administration of the University of Economics of Prague, and Liberální Institute. This year we have participants from more than a dozen countries besides Czech Republic and Slovakia, also the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, France, Poland, Denmark, Albania, Ukraine, etc., etc. Some of them distinguished full professors, some of them young assistant professors, some of them PhD students, graduate students, think tank people, or journalists. All of them, by being here, helping us to pursue our goal. This conference is an attempt to revive the tradition of critical thinking crossing boundaries of traditional disciplines. The tradition of broadly defined economics with its connection to law, political science, history, and philosophy. The tradition of Austrian economics and liberty-oriented thinking that thrived in Central Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, but sadly disappeared thereafter. For this reason, we set up 2 annual prizes called after 2 great scholars, Franz or František Cuhel and Friedrich von Wiesel, whose lives are closely connected with the city of Prague. And this afternoon, the first day of our conference, will be devoted to the legacy of these 2 great men. Tomorrow's program will be less of a celebration. We are having plenty of sessions on wonderful topics, and we expect insightful debates with your contributions, highlighting the lessons from your particular countries and particular fields of interest. However, before we start our today's program, our annual lectures, I want to express my gratitude to my young colleagues who worked hard to make this event possible, and particularly Pavel Ryska, who you corresponded with, the director of 2010 PCPE. He did a great job. So Pavel, if you are around, thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can move to the first part of the program, which is the announcement of Franz Cuhel Memorial Lecture. Franz Cuhel was a Czech economist who had been a member of Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk's seminar in the years before World War I. His book, Zur Lehre von den Bedürfnissen, or in English, On the Theory of Needs, is a famous and pioneering attempt to establish the concept of ordinal rather than cardinal utility. This achievement was acknowledged by Ludwig von Mises in his great books, and then brought through the work of Lionel Robbins into the English-speaking economic world. For those of you who are interested in reading more about Cuhel or something by Cuhel himself, I recommend you to visit the website of a journal which is an offspring of this conference, New Perspectives on Political Economy. Since this year, a scholarly journal of this college, CEVRO Institut, where I hope you are going to submit the best of your papers presented here tomorrow. Now, the first highlight is here. It is my great pleasure to have here today Professor Gerald Steele as a recipient of 2010 Franz Cuhel Memorial Prize. Professor Steele is a reader in economics at the University of Lancaster. He is a leading British Hayekian scholar, and in his writings he focuses both on the economics and political philosophy of F.A. Hayek. He has published extensively on Hayek's theory of money, capital, and business cycle, and on Hayek's comparison with his 1930s opponent, John Maynard Keynes. Professor Steele, please approach me to receive the PCPE 2010 Cuhel Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education.
I have Professor Schiemer to thank for my return to Prague after my first visit attending the PCPE last year. The architecture and culture of Prague are matched only by the hospitality of its people. Even your president shares my particular interest in Friedrich Hayek. And Václav Klaus graciously gave time to talk Hayek with me yesterday when he slotted me in between engagements with the King of Cambodia and Charles, Prince of Wales. Where else could that happen? The English have a reputation for speaking English, or rather for speaking only English. So to say that Franz Cuhel goes largely unacknowledged in my country is to state the obvious. Little of his work is available. But that is not the sole explanation for the neglect. Hayek, von Mises, and the many other economists whose analysis is driven by the paradigm of the Austrian School and whose publications are available in English are shamefully neglected by the mainstream. By the Austrian paradigm, economics deals with human action, which has the specific meaning of a path-dependent chronology of adaptation and continuous readaptation set within an ever-changing social, political, and historical context. The Austrian school deals with the complexity of evolutionary social processes, which mainstream economics says very little about, when it contents itself to differentiate a gap between a revenue and a cost function or a constrained utility function in order to obtain optimal profits or optimal satisfaction in a context that has limited relevance to time-dependent events. From the very little that is acceptable to a monolinguistic Englishman, my interest was taken by Cuhel's move away from the obsession to measure with his seminal switch from ordinal to cardinal utility, and his interest in the relevance of psychology to economics. Against the mainstream of relentless optimizations and regressions, it is possible to draw support from Albert Einstein for those who are like-minded to Cuhel. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. The modern obsession in economics with quantification reached new heights with the recent foray by economists into the literature on happiness. In the UK, this was led by Lord Richard Layard of the London School of Economics. Layard concludes that we all suffer a cognitive bias that causes us to work too much and leaves us feeling unhappy, and that redistributional taxation must be applied to rescue us from our folly. Socialist agenda takes many forms. Layard writes, happiness is just like noise. There are many qualities of noise, from a trombone to a caterwaul. But they can be compared in terms of decibels. In the same way, different types of pain, like toothache and stomachache, can be compared. So can different modes of enjoyment. Happiness and unhappiness are not separate dimensions. They are simply points along a continuum. The obvious counter to such nonsense is that Mozart's Requiem and a caterwaul may be comparable by decibels. But human achievement is never embodied in decibels. Attempts to gauge happiness monotonically, just like noise, deny the multi-dimensional experience of humankind, the elation of winning, the boredom in waiting, the pain of torture, the despair of bereavement, and so on. The human condition is complex. Austrians admit to the relevance of that complexity, which means that no Austrian economist would ever deny the contribution of other human sciences to understanding economic behavior, or ever insist upon limiting rational behavior to the mathematical certainties of the neoclassical framework. In taking the broadest view of what passes as economics, there are a few big ideas, and fewer that are good ideas. The good ideas are constrained optimization, which is the logic of pure choice, comparative advantage, which delivers specialization and mutual gains from trade, public choice theory, which examines political motivations, entrepreneurship, which is a surrogate for perfect knowledge, arbitrage, which drives the tendency to the law of one price, time-dependent value and production, which is the basis for capital theory, and that interest rates are intertemporal prices. Among the good ideas, the seventh, interest rates are intertemporal prices, receives very little attention. On the contrary, the big bad idea has usurped interest rates from their natural microeconomics context, with very bad effects. So I take this as my focus today. The intertemporal price system. With microeconomics, the interest rate is generally presented in the context of investment appraisal. Annuities are capitalized using an appropriate discount rate. With macroeconomics, the once extensive armory of Keynesian interventions is now seriously depleted. There is a much quoted indictment from the then UK Prime Minister James Callaghan at his party conference in 1976. It has resonance today. We used to think you could spend your way out of recession. I tell you in all candor that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment. That is the history of the last 20 years. Thereafter, much of the armory of Keynesian interventions was set to one side, and the Labour historian Peter Clark observed, Keynesian policies were often displayed as a magic toolkit, which could not only patch up the engine, but with fine-tuning keep it running at maximum horsepower in a trouble-free way. In the enlightened post-war world, nearly everybody swore by the magic toolkit. Thereafter, faced with an old-fashioned breakdown, they swore at it. But there is one tool in the Keynesian toolkit which remains in active use. Short-term interest rate adjustment is widely regarded as a legitimate means to steer the economy between inflation and unemployment. The schema became formalized as the Taylor rule. As an event, the Taylor rule has characteristics that run in parallel to those of the Phillips curve. Each originates in statistical correlations, which caught the imagination of the profession, shot into the textbooks in record time, spawned seemingly endless variations upon a statistical theme, and each is devoid of a coherent theoretical foundation. The Phillips curve relates a rate of change, inflation, to a level, unemployment, which itself is bizarre. The Taylor rule is a theoretical hybrid of Keynesian and classical economics. It incorporates the classical equilibrium natural rate of interest and the Keynesian concept of capacity underutilization. The Taylor rule relates short-term interest rates set by the US Federal Reserve and crude macroeconomic aggregates relating to capacity utilization, GDP, and inflation. Like Phillips' curve, Taylor rule affords great latitude for econometric extemporization, of which there's been a great deal. The Taylor rule attracts much attention. A recent review of its purpose came with the inaugural Martin Feldstein lecture in 2009, where John Taylor argued, rapid changes in events and policy have made real-time evaluation essential. There is a need to address, quote, new methodological questions about the use of high-frequency data and simulation techniques. Internet blogs, the 24-hour news cycle, and the rapid spread of ideas that have promised to take, and the rapid spread of ideas imply that real-time policy evaluation is here to stay. This is but the latest in a long line of macroeconomic advances that have promised to take Keynesian policymaking to a higher level. Yet macroeconomic forecasting is as inaccurate as it has ever been. Lawrence Klein provides a detailed history of the development of forecasting models over a period of almost 40 years. The detail of the econometric advances is impressive. Not a single comment is offered upon improvements in forecasting accuracy. Quite simply, there have been none. But that is a relatively minor problem. By their macroeconomic role in attempting to chart a fine line between inflation and unemployment, the use of interest rate variations has been compromised by their use as intertemporal price signals. Just as contracts between sellers and buyers determine prices, contracts between lenders and borrowers determine interest rates. An interest rate serves as any other price. It allocates credit which is scarce. Market prices are the only effective mechanism for reconciling scarce resources with competing and otherwise excessive demands, which is why the state has no role in setting prices. Why then are monetary authorities tasked to set interest rates? And with what consequences? By the liberal ethos, supply patterns must respond to changes in demand patterns. Price adjustments deliver that response. To understand the pricing role of interest rates, it is important to recognize that money is not essential for a credit transaction. If, say, 10 kilos of a commodity are borrowed with a contractual agreement that 11 kilos must be repaid after 1 year, the interest rate is established as 10% per annum. With or without money, interest is determined by intertemporal trading arrangements. Given that production takes time, entrepreneurs must anticipate consumers' demands as best they can. If a commodity is expected to become in relatively short supply, the market shows a premium on the forward price, giving entrepreneurs the incentive to direct more resources to production. Suppose that for wheat and barley respectively, spot prices are 150 and 100 per ton. 1 year forward prices are 180 and 90 per tonne. In comparing spot with forward prices, the cost of the delivery of wheat now is the foregone opportunity of waiting 1 year and having 20% more. Barley is a 1-year discount of 10%. From an economics viewpoint, the intertemporal price ratios for wheat, 80 over 150, 1.2, and for barley, 0.9, are regarded as own interest rates or yields. An investment of capital to produce one commodity offers a gain of 20%, and in producing the other commodity, there would be a shortfall of 10%. So the incentive is for producers to divert resources from barley, increasing its future scarcity and raising its price, to wheat, reducing its future scarcity and lowering its price. From the incentives that intertemporal prices give for entrepreneurs to reallocate resources from lower to high yielding production, there is a natural process of restoring equilibrium, or rather, a spontaneous process of continuously retargeting dynamically shifting equilibria across a multitude of markets, trading in diverse commodities. The level to which those yields are tending generally will reflect the general state of time preferences, which is one of 3 factors relevant to determining the yield of any particular investment. With positive time preference, possession per se is generally preferred at an earlier rather than a later date. The other 2 factors are default risk, a component to offset the probability that a creditor might not be repaid, and exchange risk, to reflect expectations of changing values. If a debt instrument stipulates repayment in a currency or commodity that is expected to fall in value against other currencies or commodities, an adjustment is necessary to cover that exchange risk. In an economy unaffected by any monetary disturbance, a neutral money economy, the rate charged for bank credit is determined by the general level of time preferences and the default risk assigned to any particular investment. The manner in which the bank lending rates become aligned to the general level of intertemporal prices is as follows. Where intertemporal prices are generally above bank lending rates, entrepreneurs obtain bank credit in order to commit resources to increase future supplies of commodities, causing prices to fall. The fall continues until commodity yields reach bank lending rates. Entrepreneurial activity, as always, is the equilibrating force. However, this natural tendency is routinely compromised by interventions inspired by Keynesian arguments that credit markets must serve the objectives of aggregate demand management. A tautology, the credit counterparts of broad money, brought some clarity to the confused commentary of many early Keynesian presentations. Its relevance was officially acknowledged in the UK budget statement of 1969. The credit counterparts are derived from 2 tautological structures: the double entry accounting of commercial bank credit creation and the credit instrumentation by which fiscal deficits may be financed. The credit counterpart's truism states that monetary growth is necessarily equal to the fiscal deficit minus bond sales plus commercial bank lending. For example, we can see how fiscal deficit spending, covered by open market bond sales, raises interest rates but leaves money growth unaffected. As with any tautology, the credit counterparts reveal nothing about behavioral interrelationships between, say, interest rates, private sector demand for credit, and investment decisions. In the context of Keynesian macroeconomic demand management, fiscal interventions are founded upon the presumption of an underused capacity and a positive Keynesian income multiplier. These are tantamount to the broader presumption that markets and the price system are ineffective in securing full employment and sustained growth. By the extended experimentation after the Second World War, fiscal policy was found wanting. It resulted in shifting Phillips curves and stagflation, for which the palliative of prices and incomes policies was applied in a variety of forms, and with the effect of distorting resource allocations. Both trade unions and currency speculation were scapegoats for monetary excesses. The wider lesson that ought to have been taken is that bond-financed fiscal expenditures lead inevitably to general inflation, to price distortions, and consequential microeconomic discoordination. A recent study of US defense spending in Keynesian multipliers by Nobel laureate Robert Barro concludes that defense spending significantly crowds out other components of GDP. Quoting Barro, "The largest effects are on private investment, but non-defense purchases and net exports tend also to fall. The response of private consumer expenditure differs insignificantly from zero." So much for the income multiplier. Credit policy is easily flouted by banking initiatives, is effective only where foreign exchange is controlled, and is alien to a liberal ethos. Monetary policy. Monetary supply targeting floundered upon a number of issues, among which were banking reforms and associated problems of interpretation. While in Europe, money targeting gave way to exchange rate targeting as a prelude to the introduction of the euro. And so we were left with interest rates, the one remaining tool from within the Keynesian toolbox that remains in active use. By actively manipulating interest rates in the quest for aggregate demand management, the central bank corrupts the intertemporal supply of goods and services by setting perverse incentives at a microeconomic level that incite inappropriate levels of investment and the wrong kinds of investment. Consider the production of fine brandy. Cognac can age for as long as 70 years. Broadly speaking, the value of cognac rises pro rata its aging in oak casks. In addition to the financial capital and cost of secure warehousing, there is the angel's share. Breathing deeply in a cognac warehouse is a very heady experience. However, let us assume that cognac of given initial quality is sold after it has aged 10, 15, or 20 years. Assume that in supplying cognac to each of these three markets, returns are equalized. Assume that the angel's share and the cost of warehousing are zero. And assume that a given volume of new brandy is valued at £100. Returns are equalized where, at say a discount rate of 7%, young, middle, and old brandy are sold at particular prices, namely 197, 276, and 398, to give the same capitalized value. In Austrian terminology, the structure of production is in equilibrium as entrepreneurs spread their investments in such a fashion. Now, if the discount rate is cut to 6%, the equalities are broken, setting an incentive to increase the supply of cognac to all markets, which causes prices to fall in all markets. And by the plausible assumptions that the price reductions necessary to restore equilibrium are positively related to the respective increase in supply, and that resource constraints apply, incentives are set for a disproportionate increase in the supply of old cognac. Alternatively, if the discount rate is raised from 7 to 8%, the equalities are again broken, but in the other direction, and set an incentive to cut the supply of cognac to all markets, which cause prices to rise in all markets. And again, by the plausible assumption that the price increases necessary to restore equilibrium are positively related to the respective reduction in supply, there is a disproportionate increase in the supply of old cognac. These changes illustrate the interest rate effect of Austrian business cycle theory. Austrian monetary theory of business cycles are driven by the directional impact upon investment decisions of interest rates that are held too low by monetary policy, generating an investment boom, but investments are too long, which means that there will be shortages of goods for immediate consumption, and then the impact of rising consumption good prices, the relative price effect, reverses the direction of investment incentives set up in the first place. And the general message is that easy credit causes a mismatch between demand patterns and investment plans, creating investment structures that do not match consumers' preferences. In broad outline, the sequence of an Austrian business cycle is that macroeconomic policy sets interest rates that are too low, so that investments are too many and too long, many abandoned before completion, which means that too few consumption goods are produced, and that these shortages cause their prices to rise, which resets incentives to undertake short investments, while at the same time, inflation and insolvencies add their own color to events. Theoretical details were developed by Friedrich Hayek during the 1930s. In 1927, Hayek had written, "It is not changes in the value of money which should be at issue, but disturbances in the intertemporal price system, which are without any economic function." Hayek's 1974 Nobel Prize citation names him as one of the few economists who warned about the possibility of the major crisis before the great crash came in the autumn of 1929. Mark Twain tells us, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. In the 1920s, only a mild recession would have followed growth to 27, but an easy money policy succeeded, quoting Hayek, in prolonging the boom for 2 years, postponing the normal process of liquidation. The Great Depression followed in consequence. In the 1970s, Hayek re-examined monetary distortions in the context of the labor market, trade unions, and unemployment. He was careful to engage a readership that had become well-versed in monetarism and Phillips curves. Hayek focused upon misallocations of labor and consequential unemployment that are the consequence of distortions to the structure of investments. In the 1990s, information and communication technology sectors were the primary feature of unwarranted, longer-term investments that became viable but are always unsustainable during the bank credit upswing, the dot-com bubble burst. In the 2000s, domestic property developments are the primary feature of unwarranted longer-term investments that become viable but are always unsustainable during a bank credit upswing, the housing bubble burst. Variations in yields on government debt have special relevance to interest rates generally. The relevance is that if the state wishes to raise interest rates, debt instruments must be offered to the market at reduced prices, so raising the return to lenders. In competing for savings, other institutions are forced to match those higher rates. In reverse, where the state initiates the repurchase of existing debt, bond prices rise and yields fall. Other institutions are then able to arrange their own borrowing requirements at lower rates. By such actions, which alter the composition of the national debt in terms of currency and interest-bearing securities, the state manipulates interest rates. Most often, this technique is applied at the short end of the market, by the sale and repurchase of treasury bills. Less frequently, it is applied at the long end, by dealing in gilts, when it has become known as quantitative easing. In the aftermath of the credit crunch, with short-term interest rates close to zero, quantitative easing was viewed as an additional means to ease credit. Chastened by recent defaults, commercial banks raised lending standards. To offset that tendency, the central bank buys government and corporate bonds from those commercial banks. The rationale is that with that boost to their liquidity, commercial banks become more inclined to make business loans. The oversight is that commercial banks will not lend if they do not see creditworthy clients. In the United Kingdom, the Royal Bank of Scotland is now 84% state-owned. In November last year, the Royal Bank of Scotland announced that it could not meet a 16 billion sterling business lending target set by the UK Treasury because of subdued demand from customers. The UK Treasury demanded that the state-owned RBS publish a consumer charter to show that lending terms and conditions were not too harsh. Bankers were reckless. Now they're not reckless enough. In raising bond prices and lowering long-term yields, quantitative easing has pushed up the value of pension liabilities, which has undermined the solvency of many pension funds. Shortfalls in final salary pension plans are forcing closures. By its impact on long-term interest rates, quantitative easing is further illustration of the corruption of intertemporal prices in the dubious interest of macroeconomic objectives. Keynes believed that market systems were compatible with aggregate demand management, and he ended his general theory with the following remark: the authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and freedom. But it may be possible, by a right analysis of the problem, to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. The Keynesian experiment was bold, and its influence is enduring. Its legacy is high taxation, hordes of state sector employees, incursions upon individual freedoms, and recurrent business recessions induced by meddling with interest rates. Yet hope breeds eternal, and there remain two kinds of economists: those who believe, as did Keynes, that state interventions are necessary to constrain an inherently flawed capitalist system, and those who believe resources are best allocated by a system of free market prices. The determination of interest rates is central to that ideological dispute. The argument of this paper reaches a conclusion that draws from an observation made by Winston Churchill. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others that have been tried. It has been said that market prices is the worst economic system, except all the others that have been tried. Thank you.
All right, very good. We are ready to start. Apart from annual talks, We have today for you a bonus. My friend and colleague, Miroslav Zajíček, discovered in the archives an interesting unknown fact connecting F.A. Hayek to this country, and I wish all of you to see and be part of this new discovery. So, Miroslav, the floor is now yours for 15 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Well, as you see, I have only 15 minutes, so the discovery is not that big. First, and my colleague said that the discovery of the connection of Friedrich Hayek to this country, and one of the old Czech jokes is if it's old Czech, it means usually German. Well, it's not necessarily true. Now, it's Old Czech, so it means Dutch, or mainly, or almost Dutch. So, Hayek's roots and family. There are several known facts from the Hayek's origin and the Hayek's connections to and his family tree. Well, it's pretty well known that Friedrich Hayek was related to Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher of 20th century. Well, they were usually, you can read in all textbooks or resources that they were cousins. As we will see, it's not that simple. And that connection was for the first time discovered by Hayek himself. The interesting feature or the interesting thing about Hayek and Ludwig Wittgenstein was that they didn't know each other. They didn't know about each other. They met for the first time waiting on a railway station, and they looked pretty similarly. They looked, the outer appearance was so similar. We will see some pictures, but so they somehow on that railway station came to a conclusion that they had to be related somehow, and that turned out to be true. They were, well, not really cousins, but they were related. Well, Hayek definitely had some Czech roots. Well, by name itself, for those who do not speak Czech, the Hayek means the little forest in Czech, or something similar. It's not exactly the same. But there are some slight differences with forest roots and other words mean. So this is the Wittgenstein family, one of the most important family of late Austria-Hungarian Empire. And this guy on the picture is Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose family roots are mainly in the northern Westphalia. But this part of the family, as we have here, is the Jewish family from Prague. Actually, those were the parents of his wife, and they financed the rise of Karl Wittgenstein in the northern Bohemia. And I will show you this name, Leopoldina Kalmus, who was the wife of Karl Wittgenstein, whose family financed Wittgenstein's rise. And maybe the Czechs among you know the name of the company called Poldi. Poldi is just the abbreviation or short way to say Leopoldina. It's one of the most important Czech companies. It still exists. It went through the spectacular bankruptcy in the 90s, but they're rising from ashes some parts of it. And we see this is Poldi Kladno. This is the company that was founded by by Karl Wittgenstein. Not Ludwig. Ludwig actually declined his family heritage, but by Karl Wittgenstein. And if it seems similar, this part, for some people it might seem a little similar to what they should probably know. It's, if you know the movie stupid Hollywood movie, The Czech Connection, that was shot here, yeah, in this part. But anyway, this Auntie Polly was really the aunt of Friedrich Hayek. And I will show the connection. This is Hayek and Wittgenstein connection. Here we see Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher. If you know the picture of Hayek, well, they pretty look the same, but he's a little bit. No mustache, but if you don't think about mustache, they look pretty similar. Anyway, they were connected through this ancestor. Stahlner, the family Stahlner, that was the family from southern Austria. Well, now it's actually the part of Slovenia. As you see, the connections are through the whole Central Europe. So the Ludwig Wittgenstein was, let me count it. Yeah, it was Ludwig Wittgenstein, great-grandfather, and Friedrich August von Hayek's great-great-grandfather. So they were cousins in a sense. And it's pretty strange that they did know each other, because Hermina Wittgenstein, who was the sister of Ludwig Wittgenstein, was the family friend of Felicitas von Jurasek. And Felicitas von Jurasek was Friedrich's mother, but they still didn't know each other, which is strange, at least for me. And they lived not very far from each other in Vienna, so pretty strange. But anyway, next slide. How Hayek actually became the von Hayek. It's from his another great-great-grandfather, who was ennobled in 1789, in August 1789, by the Emperor Joseph II. Well, Joseph Hayek was the director and co-owner of 2 cotton factories in southern Moravia, one, and one part of Austria, the second. I have no idea whether the factory in Austria still exists or not. But what I know, that the factory founded by Joseph Hayek in Letovice, which is the city in southern Moravia, still exists and still is producing actually the fabric. So it's still working. I tried to contact them about they had some interest in one of the founders of the company. They didn't have not only they didn't have a clue about who Hayek is, but they had no interest in that. It's like, maybe you as a state organization should pay the research in that. Anyway, so Joseph Hayek started his career in 1775 as an employee of Czech-Austrian Court Chamber under the nobleman Jan Christopher Blumegen, who was the founder of those both factories. And the good way of how to make a career for a young man was to marry the daughter of his boss. So Joseph Hayek married Amalia von Blumegen, and his story was this house. So Joseph von Hayek lived in his house, in this house for many years, and the whole Hayek's family and descendants of Hayek's family lived in this house till 1880. So for about 100 years in Brno, and you see that this house is still there. This is the current state of the house. This is the picture from 30s, and this was a picture from late 19th century. And if you like my graphs of family trees before, this is an even better one. This is the connection that this graph should show the connection between the Blumegen family. Oh, sorry. The Blumegen family here on the left upper part of the graph, and Hayek's family here. Here's the marriage between Joseph von Hayek and Amalia von Blumegen. This Blumegen family was, it was a family of Moravian governors in 18th century. So actually Hayek is a descendant of Moravian governors, and those were descendants from some Dutch North German nobility. Bloemeken, see the name. They went through from Netherlands to North Westphalia and then to Moravia, make a great career, and then disappeared. Some of those were even the archbishops, bishops of several on several posts here. And they built several chateaus in southern Moravia. And Hayek is a direct descendant of this family. And here is Hayek and his family. So this is all what I had to say about Hayek's Czech connection, which are pretty interesting. And I would say, well, it's mostly Central European connections. It shows how the Central Europe was interconnected, because a little irony in that is that the Wittgenstein family and Hayek's family that were connected through Slovenian family were also connected through families from Northern Westphalia, which is typically Czech. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Miroslav. And now it's time for our second annual lecture. Friedrich von Wieser belongs to the towering figure of the second generation of the Austrian School of Economics, who produced such scholars as Friedrich August von Hayek. Wieser taught here in Prague for more than a decade, leaving only in 1903 to take over Karl Menger's chair in Vienna. Wieser will be always remembered by economists as the author of the concept of opportunity costs. Well, I'm very delighted to introduce to you PCPE 2010 Wieser Memorial Prize recipient, Professor Richard Epstein. Richard Epstein graduated from Columbia University in 1964. He received his BA from Oxford in 1966. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1968. He began his teaching career at the University of Southern California Law School. Currently, Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law and the Director of the Law and Economics Program at the University of Chicago Law School. He is also the Peter and Kirsten Bedford Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Since 2007, he has been a visiting professor of law at New York University School of Law and will be joining as a permanent faculty member. Richard Epstein is considered to be one of the most influential legal thinkers of modern times, one of the most often cited lawyer and economist, and a libertarian political philosopher. Professor Epstein is an enormously productive author, and since yesterday is also having his first book translated into Czech. Professor Epstein, please approach me to receive the 2010 PCPE Wieser Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education.
I do have a lecture, and I'll even give you the title of the topic, which is called Risk and Regulation, and I will get to it in a moment. But somehow or other, watching all of these slides with all of this Hayek stuff, it sort of made me into an intensely autobiographical person for a minute or two. And as I sat here, I tried to figure out what the influence of Wittgenstein and Hayek was on one Richard A. Epstein. And the answer is it was actually fairly pronounced. I should say that I have no formal training in economics. In the good old American style, if you want to say you know something, you say you know it, and you announce yourself to be an expert in the field. Formal training doesn't matter. But I had read a fair bit of Wittgenstein as an undergraduate, and the line, of course, that leaves me most, and I've never been able to follow it in my entire life, is the last sentence in the Tractatus, if one remembers, whereof you know nothing, thereof you must be silent, right? it never stopped me in my entire life. And so I think one of the ways in which I've always been able to learn is to speak about things that I don't know, and in the course of speaking about it, actually learn something about it. And then after you've learned something about it, what you do is you sit down and write down what you just said without the mistakes. Hayek came into my life somewhat later, and as usual, this was when I was at the Yale Law School. We did not read him in college or in England in law school. I was introduced to him when somebody had some dismissive notion about him in one of the classes, and I listened to it and I said, the sneer doesn't seem to be worthwhile. All of the information that one heard about how it is that uncoordinated, decentralized prices convey information struck me as being extremely ingenious, because even as a young, uninformed legal thinker, I was always deeply skeptical of the kind of utopian optimism which is sometimes associated with central planning. And so Hayek sort of struck a very responsive chord in my life. And as I got older and I actually started to read the stuff, I became quite convinced that this was truly a seminal mind. And as usual, spent most of my time trying to attack what I thought to be his errors rather than to praise what I thought to be his contributions. Because what's the fun of telling somebody when he's right? It's only fun to take after them when you think they're wrong. And the odd thing about Hayek is that his errors are worth correcting, whereas some people like Karl Marx, they're just worth forgetting, so you have a rather different view of the world. And my view has been heavily influenced by these people. I would also want to add there's something else about them, Wittgenstein and Hayek, which wasn't mentioned in the last talk, but I think was very important, is that somehow or other they start in Austria and they end up in England, right, where they do much of their work. And part of the influence on me was that I was an English-trained lawyer. That BA that Joseph referred to was actually a law degree. It was not some sort of undergraduate degree. And so I was first trained in English law and then in American law. And I'm happy to say that the dual education in my life was one of the most important features, because one of the reasons why it's so important to be educated outside of your home system is you break the natural monopoly that the dominant modes of thought would otherwise have upon you. American lawyers, when they start to think about stuff, tend to think about it in terms of constitutional law first, federalism second, private law third. And when you go to England, which is essentially a unitary system in which most of the grand decisions, at least in 1964 to 66 when I studied there, were made by civil servants, what happened is you began with the private law first and then worked up to the public law. And as far as I am concerned, this is exactly a parallel to the situation with respect to economics. If you know the private law, you can put the public law together piece by piece and brick by brick. And in economics, my view is if you don't know microeconomics, there's no way you're going to figure out macroeconomics, because what happens is it's the same kind of orderly accretion, trying to figure out how it is when you have more and more complicated structures, you can make generalizations about the many, which would be true if you knew something about the one. And so what I'm going to talk about today is, in effect, part of that kind of a transition from the system of private law to the system of public law. And I'm going to try to talk about it in a way which indicates that the difficulties that we have in risk regulation with respect to modern public law comes from the fact that we have forgotten the way in which a private law system ought to work. And so let me now turn to my kind of topic and see if I could explain to you the way in which it all fits together. As most of you know, there is a kind of a constellation of beliefs that we all regard as kind of central and relevant to our core. Private ordering, private property, freedom of contract, and so forth. And generally speaking, when you try to put together the pieces of a classical liberal order or a laissez-faire order, what we do is we concentrate on the tidiest portions of the overall system, which is essentially the delineation of the formal sets of rights that we think exist amongst various individuals. And so when we start with property rights, the great genius of the system is that we have a one-size-fits-all solution, universal forbearance against physical invasion of one person by another, which is a powerful solution to a very complicated problem of multiple coordination, because the rules tend to be scalable, the rules tend to be independent of wealth, the rules tend to be very... Is somebody disagreeing with me, or is this thing just popping up? I'll go back a little bit, my wife says. All right. A whole variety of situations that these rules essentially make the kinds of transacting much easier than they would otherwise be. And then out of this particular system, what we do is we get two other kinds of rules. We get the illegal sorts of transactions called torts. And what we then do is we compensate people by giving them damage for the things that have been broken. And then we have the consensual route that's dealing with this, and that's the contract side, in which we can get specialization and gains from trade. And we provide contractual remedies to allow essentially for sequential performance. I can do something today knowing that I will be able to enforce my promise by getting you to do your thing tomorrow. And so at the end of the day, we have damages and torts, and we have a variety of reliefs in contract. And if you listen to the way I've just described the system, there's no uncertainty built into the particular rules. The legal system, as we understand it in this very simple model, intervenes after the events have gone their way, and the only kinds of uncertainty we have, which in fact, as you become more ambitious, becomes more difficult, is the question of proof as to whether or not there was a breach of contract, whether or not there was a personal injury, whether or not one person hit the other, or whether it was somebody else, and so forth. But the basic attraction of this system is that if we abstract away from the evidentiary problems and worry about the normative problems, what we can do is to develop a system which essentially has a kind of legal completeness associated with it. And in fact, once you really understand how the thing works, it's quite elegant in the way in which a common law system of rights can be put together. And so many people who come out of the libertarian tradition, broadly conceived as I do, tend to have a very high premium on completeness and so forth, and they think that the legal system that they're about to put together has very powerful deductive qualities, so that it almost approaches the sense of natural truth, or sort of necessary truth. And there's no doubt when you start going back to the natural law tradition from which all of this stuff comes, and they start talking about, you know, the situations of ratio naturalis, the reason of nature and so forth, words like immutable and invariant and necessary are very common on the lips of the individuals who defend this kind of system. And what they can do quite correctly is point out that under many circumstances, the variations that you see in legal rules as you go from country to country are much smaller than the variations you see in cultural practices between these kinds of nations. As a person who started as a Roman lawyer before he became a common lawyer, I've always been impressed at the powerful similarities between the two systems, which dominate the small differences on procedure and formality, and have always been impressed about how easily these systems, either or both of them, have been able to be taken to very strange kinds of cultures, Japan, you know, and so forth, and China, or whatever it is, where the cultural differences are vast and the legal implantations tend to take very well. So there's this kind of nice logical quality. And then you look at the title of my talk and you realize nothing I've said thus far relates to this at all. What I've been talking about thus far has been elegance, formality, and completeness, and the title of my talk is Risk and Regulation. And this is the way in which you start to get to that question, which is when you are trying to run a complicated legal system, you cannot only run it from the back end after the harms have occurred. What you have to do is to run it from the front end when it turns out there's some very high level of uncertainty as to whether or not certain events will play out in good ways or will play out in bad ways. So go back to the particular legal theory and then just reformulate it a bit, and you can start to see as the anxiety is going to creep in. And you now say, well, what's the fundamental prohibition with respect to our system? And it turns out it's a prohibition against the use or the threat of force. And the use stuff is very easy to talk about in terms of completed wrongs. But when you're talking about threats, by definition, you're talking about a situation in which the harm has yet to be consummated. And then, in effect, you have to do a little bit of linguistic analysis and ask yourself precisely what you mean when you start to talk about a threat. And it turns out that we can give two very different meanings to the term threat, which seem to generate two quite different responses, one which is relatively straightforward, and the other which turns out to be far more complicated. So the first thing that we can say about the threat of force is, in effect, what happens is that the individual actor who could have otherwise committed force has announced to the world at large that he prepared to use it to somebody else. So I go up to Joseph and I say to him, I'm going to threaten you with all sorts of mayhem. unless you come along and do exactly what I want. And there's no question under those circumstances that every legal system will give him protection, not only in damages after he's maimed or killed, but will give him some anticipatory relief, either by way of personal self-defense or by having a police force come in there and protect him from the kinds of assaults that we have. And we don't even think twice about this particular situation, because we know, in effect, that the only two states of the world are going to happen. Either he completes the thing on the one hand, or he's stopped on the other. What we are quite confident about is, given the nasty nature of the threat that I've just made, there's nothing useful whatsoever that comes by waiting and allowing me to essentially consummate that particular harm. So the relief that we give is kind of very universal, very powerful, because we see only one kind of error that really starts to matter, and that's the error of allowing me to execute the particular wrong that I otherwise would have to take. This is, of course, makes the case relatively easy. So what we now do is we have a little bit of a linguistic transformation, and all of a sudden the world becomes a far more complicated place in trying to figure out how it is that we regulate threats of force in a society which is dedicated to property rights of one form or another. And what we do is we don't think of the situation of my action where I'm threatening Joseph with some particular act. What we do, in effect, is that we now have discovered a situation where I'm about to undertake some kind of an action which has a positive probability of doing a very useful consequence, which involves no harm to any other individual, and also a positive probability of doing some harm to other individuals in other states of the world. And so now the question is, what do we do under these circumstances? We can't say just shut the man down, because at this particular point, there are now two kinds of error that you have to worry about and have to figure out devices to minimize their sum. So already the libertarian calculus is not going to solve this particular problem. Whether you like it or not, every natural lawyer becomes a closet utilitarian when they're trying to figure out how it is that you weigh benefits and costs of certain kinds of relief when you're not sure at the outset whether the action that's about to be undertaken is going to be a good one or a bad one in the way in which its consequences go. So we don't know when I drive the car whether I'm going to get safely to my destination, which is a wonderful consequence, or whether I'm going to take that car and crash into somebody, which is a terrible consequence. So what is it that we try to do? Well, the first approximation that we make under all of these situations is to try to figure out what the two kinds of errors are and to sort of weight them. And your sort of intuitive utilitarian calculus, which is wrong but instructive, goes something as follows. You start off and take all the states of the world in which things are going to go good, and then what you do is you attach the value associated with all of these things. Then you take all the states of the world in which you can go bad, figure out what their probabilities are, and attach some weight to them. And at this particular point, if you think back to what was said earlier, it turns out you cannot be an ordinalist if you're trying to play this particular game. You have to become some kind of a cardinalist, that is somebody who's going to attach numerical values to the particular state of affairs, because otherwise you can't make the comparisons between the two of them in terms of your expected value calculations. And for somebody who comes out of the Hayekian tradition and out of the Austrian tradition, this is actually a genuine wrench, because you're forced to assign values to situations for which they're not determinate market estimations, and yet on the other hand, if you don't do it, you become absolutely useless, because then you cannot make any kind of judgment whatsoever. So just the way in which you state this particular problem shows you immediately that you have now journeyed to this unhappy world of the second best, in which you have to take conceptions of value which are less than perfectly rigorous in order to be able to come up with conclusions that make a modicum of good sense. And I think, generally speaking, one of the things that lawyers are sensitive to in a way that economists are not is when it is that the empirical demands of coming to a particular conclusion become so important that what you have to do is to take theory and give it a swift kick in the pants and say, we know that the best measure is X, and we know that we cannot use it under these circumstances because it doesn't allow us to decide whether or not to have a go or a no-go theory. Now, once you do this thing, the second problem, in the most simple form imaginable, comes forward in the following way. how do you configure these estimations of probability states and value states? And here, the general state of the world that we have with respect to most mundane activities like driving a car and so forth is as follows. Most of the time, the positive utility from these things is going to be small. And so on the one side of the equation, on the benefit side, what you do is you have a set of probabilities when summed up which are very large, producing relatively small benefits in each state of the world. And so if you multiply these numbers, you get, say, a probability on average of 0.99 something or other. And what you do is you get an amount of gain in each case, which is, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever it is. Then on the other side, what you do is you have a very low probability. And unfortunately, when you start talking about adverse consequences in many of these cases, what happens is that number can be very, very large. And if you're trying to figure out a system which will embarrass the hell out of you as a serious scholar, trying to figure out what you do when you're comparing high probability, low return states with low probability, large adverse condition states, what you do is you find that this is a very difficult kind of calculation to meet. And the only thing that you can say with complete confidence when you're doing all of this is there is no dominant solution, which allows you to say, always let the activity go forward, never let the activity go forward, and so forth. Right, so that's the first problem. Second problem is what's the mechanism that can be used to deal with this? And as I've indicated to you, this is the first place in which the relationship between private and public law takes place. And let me give you two kinds of illustrations about the way in which the difference can happen to occur. In the one situation, we have a man who's running a factory, and all the positive states of the world are when he has a high level of production and emits no pollution. And the low probability bad state of the world is that there's one guy next door who, if in fact this thing goes wrong, has his own property wiped out, dies of cyanide poisoning or something of the sort. Well, under these circumstances, you're willing to allow for private remedies to take place because all the anticipated harm and all the actual harm are in the same person, so you don't have any coordination problem with respect to victims. But if you then switch over to the driving case, it turns out you have a very different state of the world. If, in fact, you're in the ex post state and this reckless Mr. Shima comes along there and bashes somebody, we know who the proper plaintiff is going to be in the ex post world. It's the party whom he's hit. But in the ex ante world, the probability that any one person like Mr. Steele will be that fellow is very, very small. So no single individual is going to be prepared to enjoin the kind of activity which for the collectivity, in fact, may be enjoinable. So at that particular point, given the diffuse nature of the uncertain harm, what you have to do is to switch from private to public enforcement. And at that particular point, it means that all of a sudden, coordinated activity by a state authority becomes essentially the dominant solution. All right, now you've solved that problem, which creates all sorts of public choice issues about how you run this situation. So what's the next problem that starts to come up when you're starting to deal with these particular people? And here, of course, there are two real dimensions of immense difficulty in this case that have to be negotiated. And the first one of those is when you start to talk about a ban, what you mean is I can stop everybody from driving on the grounds that somebody's likely to cause an accident, or what I can try to do is to create bans which are not quite as comprehensive and have rather different sort of strategies associated with them. And indeed, nobody says, because we know that every driver has a positive probability of killing some random pedestrian every time he or she takes to the wheels, that what we're going to do is stop all automobiles from being used. For one thing, if you don't drive automobiles, you're going to go on bicycles, and the same thing exists with respect to bikes. And if you don't do that, you're going to have to walk, and by the time you're done, you'll be back to the Stone Age, because nobody wants to take a risk of transportation errors, which means that you have to take the risk of starvation from other sources. So the moment you realize that you can't go back to a zero world, managing risk is managing risk as against alternatives. So then what are the strategies? Well, there are multiple strategies. And one of them is we can say, look, we're not going to ban everybody. We're going to allow entry into a particular business only after you go through a licensing system. So what that means, in effect, is you test drivers for general competence. Those who pass the situation will in fact be able to use the public highways, subject to the damage remedy at the back end, right? And those who flunk the system will not be able to go on the property. So what we've done is we've now managed to sort out the really high offenders from the low offenders. But even this solution is not going to be extremely decisive when you're talking about risk and regulation, because the information that you get ex post, that is after the licensing procedure has taken place, will indicate that you've always made, by virtue of the initial test, some mistake in the way the system has been organized. So some of your very successful drivers will turn out to be, or testers, will turn out to be very bad drivers. So at this point, you now have to have another set of systems, citations, tickets, points, and so forth, in which after somebody commits a certain number of errors within the system, you put them into the prohibited class. So essentially, the designed features have two particular elements that are associated with respect to their operation. One is the scope of the injunction, which could be absolute or qualified. And then, since this is an evolving problem, the second element associated with the situation is a temporal element. If we do it now, do we have to do something later? Should we do nothing at stage one and wait until stage two comes, when you're closer to the harm, before you engage in these kinds of activities? And these are very hard trade-offs to make, because if you in effect follow the rule, which says that you have to license, that means that anybody and everybody who wants to engage in an activity has to have a direct interaction with the state, whereas it may well be under certain circumstances you can avoid that if you adopt a different kind of program. So if you go back to the land illustration, with certain kinds of risks, like, you want to open up a cyanide factory, and if the thing leaks, everybody in town is going to die, we will certainly have ourselves a system of very stringent ex-ante regulations as who can get into the cyanide production business. But we would be foolish to say that because we're doing that for cyanide, we have to do that with ordinary construction, where in fact there is some modest risk that every time you put up a building, even if it's in the best part of town by the ablest builder, that somebody's going to knock this thing down. So what the common law essentially has done in its evolution is to say, generally speaking, we tend to stay away from the comprehensive ex-ante licensing type situation. Let the state put that in through an administrative process as appropriate, but the private law system is usually gone as follows. We do very little by way of sort of early warning injunctive relief in terms of dealing with the risk to property rights of the neighbors, but once you get to a point where the harm has actually occurred, or where the future harm is imminent, then we start throwing the book at people. And what we mean by that is, by the quid pro quo, for letting people sort of decide how to design and build their houses in whatever way they see fit, is that if you get close to the point where you're going to create peril to somebody else, we shut you down and we have no balance of equities to give you a second chance. And the reason why we like this particular system is twofold. One is that if everybody understands the rule, that they get too close to the line, they're going to be shut down. The prudent individuals will back off of that situation so as to avoid creating any kind of imminent peril one way or another. And the second thing is that we know when we put this system together, we still have the damage rule in place, which says that as you start doing these kinds of things, if we don't catch you by having some knowledge of imminent harm, and the harm does occur in a way which is attributable to you, we then hit you with the damage remedy. So we have basically two powerful deterrents, one which requires you to pay damages, and the other subjects you to the risk to shut down. And by using a relatively inexpensive system of this sort, we can essentially sort out the high-risk cases from the low-risk cases and try to keep ourselves with a relatively low level of government intervention in order to handle a very difficult kind of problem. And so when you teach the private law of property rights, what you have to do is to remember that to the usual economists, the big issues are how do you define these rights and what are the contractual ways that they go. Most people who are thinking about this from a sort of systematic view tend to ignore the sort of breakdown of the system and the anticipatory relief that you give when there's an invasion. But there is a long legal tradition developed in particular by 19th century English judges, most of whom were closet laissez-faire thinkers, I'm happy to say, which sort of reflects this kind of intuition. I leave it to better minds than my own to decide whether this is a form of Hayekian spontaneous evolution or whether or not it turns out to be a more systematic way of approaching the subject. For my own self, I've always been a half Hayekian on this issue, in the sense that I believe that the way in which people get to these solutions usually starts in a fairly intuitive way, and then the way in which you defend them requires a greater degree of formalization using game theory or some other technique, and that the secret is you don't try to formalize a set of institutions that you invent out of your own head. You tend to try to formalize those systems which seem to have worked well for a very long period of time in order to isolate what you regard as their preferred kinds of activities. So that's the way in which I think your common law systems start to run. And basically, to summarize it, is comprehensive ex-ante regulation exists where you know there's a very high probability of something going wrong and you have to weed some people out. And then for the rest of it, you delay the injunction, give no forgiveness, and give very strict damages after the fact. And the question is, how does this carry over when you start to move to public law events? And what I'm going to do is to talk, and see how much time I have left, let me talk about a couple of different ways in which these paradigms have played themselves out, so that what you can see is, in effect, a lot of what goes on in public law depends on the way in which your constitutional system conceptualizes and organizes property rights. Now, for many of you who come from countries outside the United States, particularly from the British type situation or the Central European situation, there tends not to be a strong constitutional system which regulates the way in which you start to think about risk and regulation. If you come from the American system, it turns out that this issue is one of the most important ones that you see litigated anywhere throughout the system. And in order to understand the way in which legal systems deal with uncertainty, what you have to do is to tie it in to what is called in the United States standards of scrutiny that are given to government regulations, which are designed to deal with anticipatory harms that themselves have not yet occurred. And this could be over any number of a range of cases. The earliest cases that dealt with this in a systematic fashion had to do with the Espionage Acts of 1917 and the question as to whether or not certain speech had a tendency to overthrow the government of the United States by force and violence. And if you weren't sure what that speech was going to do, which way did you set the odds? More modern applications of this take place in all sorts of other areas. One of the most important is in drug regulation. Another turns out to be in terms of environmental protection. A third area turns out to have to do with the questions associated with the disposable nature of nuclear waste. And to most people who work in the individual areas, there's always a tendency to stress the separate and individual features of these systems. But for somebody like myself, for whom risk and regulation is a generic category, it's much more important to see the common elements that link these things together than it is to sort of overstress some of the tiny details of the individual scheme. So let me start and indicate that with respect to American standards, when you're trying to figure out how you evaluate government activities or attitudes towards risk, much depends on what is called the level of scrutiny that you bring to these things. And the way in which our system has evolved over time, particularly in the post-New Deal period, is we have certain rights that are regarded as high valued and certain rights that are regarded as low valued, not only for the parties involved, but for the sort of overall systematic health of the system in question. And on the high valued side, what happens is you put certain things like speech, and on the low valued side, I'm not so happy to say, you put things like property rights. The dominant feature in the United States is we have a bunch of judges who have never quite convinced themselves that a strong system of private property rights has some really important social functions to perform, but they all seem to understand that the ability to preserve the right to criticize the government is in fact an essential element in trying to keep a democratic society at large. And in a strange sense, I agree with these judges. If I had to have strong protection for property rights or strong protections for protesters against the government, on balance, I would probably want the political stuff, because unless you do that, you'll end up degenerate down into various kinds of dictatorships, and those will turn out to be very disrespectful for property rights as well. But I don't think the synthesis is right by saying that it has to be one or the other. And so how do you then put these things into question? Well, basically, it turns out the standards of scrutiny are analysis for error. And when we say that we're going to give strict scrutiny to a statute which limits the ability of individuals to speak, what we are saying, in effect, is that the error cost of a restriction is far greater than the error cost of letting somebody go on, speak on. And in the area of speech, for example, with defamation, the rule is so powerful that you can never get an injunction against defamatory speech. What happens is the only thing is that you get a remedy after the fact for the harm that's done. So we have a categorical rule. When you deal with other types of situations, for example, like the question as to whether or not when you get classified documents you want to publish them, at that point the state interest is thought to be a lot higher than it is in the ordinary defamation case. And certainly if what you want to do is to publish stuff about the movement of troops or give information out to your enemies so they could blow up a factory, we throw the book at you. But in the famous Pentagon cases, where the release by Daniel Ellsberg involved a long and torturous history of how the United States blundered into the Vietnam War, the judges weren't prepared to give any kind of injunctive relief at all. So that the practice in all of these cases tends with strict scrutiny to be very much against preparatory relief. And in the first line of cases involving the Espionage Act, which I referred to, they developed the clear and present danger test. And essentially what happened is, if you were a guy who got in front of somebody on a street corner and announced the imperative necessity of the overthrow of capitalist institutions which managed to oppress all individual citizens, nobody today could throw you in jail on the grounds that some benighted fool would listen to that and start to throw bombs into a courthouse. The rule would be you wait until somebody has a bomb near a courthouse or somebody starts an actual plot against a determined person, a target, and then you can punish them. So we've always engaged essentially in a model which looks remarkably like the common law model, which is you delay the imposition of the restrictions until you are very, very confident that the threat is relatively imminent and certain. You are worried about the overthrow. When you start getting into the property type situations, all of a sudden the impulses that take place on this differ very sharply from what they were at common law. And as you note, when I started to speak about this particular topic, what I did is I indicated that there was an easy way in which that you could move from public to private law in dealing with the injunctions by saying that the injunction becomes a licensing system when you're not quite sure who the determined target of the bad driving is going to be, but it remains a private system of enforcement if there's only one or a very small number of individuals who are likely to be in the way of particular harm. Now, what happens is, in the modern times, as we start moving in property areas from private to public enforcement, everything seems to change in terms of the way in which the system starts to operate. And let me mention what two of the changes are, both of which I think are actually quite harmful for the way in which a property system can operate. The first thing is that we change the property rights as we change the mode of enforcement from private to public. So, for example, when you're dealing with private enforcement, if your neighbor wants to build a house which will block your view, generally speaking, the only way you could get him to rip that thing down is to buy it out of him. But when we start moving into the public space, and we don't worry about essentially injunctions, but worry about zoning ordinances, the class of protected interest by neighbors becomes very much broader, and all of a sudden all sorts of anti-competitive behavior can now be protected by preventing people from building precisely because somebody else's view is going to be blocked, or the new business will be in competition with an old business, or there'll be a wetland that's filled up, or an endangered species that's harmed in one sense or another. And so you going into the public space, you now run the high risk of confiscation, which you did not have under the common law system of injunctions. This is a very, very big deal, because to try to enjoin nuisances in the traditional common law sense is pretty easy. There are almost no cases today that I've ever read where there's a serious question as to whether or not you're enjoining something which is likely to be a nuisance. A guy is going to invest $100 million in building a skyscraper your basic intuition is he does not want this building to fall down within 24 hours of its completion, because wholly apart from the liability that will happen, he's lost $100 million in trying to build this building up. So you don't think of these as serious issues. You span it and now allow views and light and everything else to count. Everything becomes enjoyable. I mean, my daughter's a real estate developer, and she says, I wish people would get over it. There's no way in New York City that you can build a building without blocking somebody's view or somebody's light. Why is it that we always have to make accommodations under this particular measure, which usually change the profile of the shadow rather than eliminating the entire thing at all? And that's one of the things that you have to worry about. The second kind of mistake that we tend to make in all of these cases is, even if you're starting to deal with the kinds of harm which would be actionable if completed, instead of having the imminent danger threat, which is applied at the end of the process, we move into the public space away from the injunction model to a different model. And the model that we move to is, in effect, one in which the applicant for a permit must show to the satisfaction of the authorities that there's absolutely no probability of any of the particular kinds of harms taking place before they're willing to allow you to do this. So instead of waiting until the pollution is about to happen and then shutting the business down, what you now do is have a very different kind of inquiry about the way in which you think on this. And the inquiry says, show us your filtration system. And then you show them the filtration system. Then they will say, show us that it's big enough to handle peak load that could possibly happen in this building. And then they say, well, what do we mean by peak load? Well, figure out a system of emissions which is likely to happen 1 part in 10 to the 6, and you've got to be able to design against that. Okay, well, you start to do that. Then they say, well, you've done it now to show how this thing is going to work in the short term, but how do we know that this system is going to be maintained so that 5 years from now we'll have the same level of efficiency? So give us your maintenance schedules with respect to the way in which this particular situation is going to work. So then you solve all that problem, and by the time you manage to get rid of it with respect to one kind of pollutant, somebody will say, well, if you've got a filter which is very good against X pollution, it may increase the number of Y pollutants that take place. Now you have to show us that you haven't created any alternative hazard, and you don't care about what the probability is. So by the time you're done under these systems, the level of scrutiny that takes place at the ex-ante space is exceedingly high, and the number of cases where any of this actually matters is exceedingly low. And what you do is you get an incredible system of extra cost and extra delay. And sure enough, the moment you introduce cost and delay, what happens is the rent seekers start to take over. So who is it that is desperately worried about this 1 in 10 million chance of some kind of a leakage? Well, it's the guy next door who runs the competitive business, who knows that if he can slow you down for 6 months or for a year or for 2 years, he's basically managed to keep that monopoly going on a little bit longer and a little bit stronger. And so what you do, in effect, by creating these ridiculous standards with respect to antecedent risk, is you manage to disrupt the operation of a competitive economy by blocking new kinds of entries on phony kinds of grounds. And this then turns to create all sorts of distortions in rental markets and so forth. So this is not a small question. Once you, in effect, start with this permit kind of culture, what I'm talking about is absolutely the dominant sort of response. So let me now just talk about this in 2 other ways, and then I will be done with my 45 minutes, and I will take a breath. I just took a breath. And the first of them is you start looking at the business associated with the approval of drugs. Now, this is a classic illustration of a very serious 2 kinds of error problem. The first thing to note about drugs is that, generally speaking, they are given to people who are at risk of bad outcomes. And there are all sorts of different variations on this. There are many drugs which are designed to cure, quote unquote, cancers, by which we mean by cure is you have somebody with a 3rd stage metastatic cancer which is now spread to the brain, and your so-called cure is trying to extend 6 months of life to somebody. And the question is, does this drug do this or not, or does it hasten death? Then there are other kinds of drugs like Lipitor, which are exactly in the opposite camp. You have people like myself with a risk of elevated cholesterol or something like that, and what you're trying to do is to give them a drug which hopefully they'll be able to take for years, and the question is whether or not it will keep that cholesterol level down, particularly of the bad kind, so as to reduce the probability of a heart attack or some other kind of condition. So you have all sorts of very different risk-benefit profiles that take place. And the question is, how would one want to deal with these questions? If you're a person who starts with the Hayekian framework that I've just sort of given to you, this is the basic attitude that you're going to have. There's relatively little ground whatsoever for very strong ex-ante government regulation of the sort that comes with most food and drug authorities. In fact, having worked with this system fairly close on for many years now, I've come to the conclusion that the only sensible thing that a government might be able to perform, it's sensible because anybody else could do it as well, is a system which says we do not allow onto the market for either experimental or permanent use any drug which cannot pass a phase 1 trial. And for those of you who don't understand the pharmaceutical lingo, a phase 1 trial refers to a trial where you give a high dosage of drugs to human beings after passing some animal trials, and it turns out that everybody dies, you flunk phase 1 and you don't do it, and the number of drugs that people are willing to take which are going to kill you for certain within 24 hours is rather small. So you're not keeping off the market stuff that people want. But then once you pass a phase 1 trial, what you said it hasn't killed you, now it's a question of whether or not its benefits exceed its cost. And the argument that I would make is that state regulation, which has a power to ban until the cost-benefit ratio is proven correct, turns out to be the major mistake in drug regulation. So this puts me in the, shall we say, in the circle of hell with respect to standard regulators on these issues who believe, in effect, that a government should evaluate very detailed stuff on safety and effectiveness before anything is allowed to go on the market. This is not a question of warning about risk and letting people decide. This is a question of deciding for them, which has obviously a certain kind of paternal overtone. Now, why is it that you say that this is true? Well, if you remembered, one of the arguments that I made against an injunction is that there was the ability to have some downstream remedy that would protect you after the thing was let to go past the first stage. So what you could do is enjoin something at the time of imminent peril rather than having all those permit plans go on. It's even stronger with respect to drugs because generally speaking, there's no involuntary administration of drugs to people. Even if you let something go on the market, you can't put it into a syringe and stab it into some random bystander. Essentially, you have to get patient consent to use it. And there is a very elaborate downstream system of physician oversight, informed consent, and so forth, which means that when people make these choices, they're not making them in the blind. They get themselves some professional advice. It turns out, by the way, that even that is not the sole kind of protection that happens. Information about drugs depends on a peculiar mixture between background probabilistic information and idiosyncratic personal information. There's a median and there's a variance, and you have to know something about what the median is and what the variance is, and then we call it empirical, which is if you know there's a high degree of variance, you try it out. Some people will get sick instantly and they'll drop it. Others actually seem to benefit from the drugs. At this point, we don't know who's in which category or why. And what the system says is the moment you have heterogeneity with respect to responses, single one-size-fits-all responses don't make any sense. And sure enough, at that point, you want to get information as to who's likely to be a good or a bad candidate. And oddly enough, the FDA doesn't supply that information. It only says the drug is okay, it's safe and effective. They don't mean that at all. They mean it's safe enough and effective enough that we're going to let you figure out yourself whether to use it. But there are organizations, I'll give you just one, it's called the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, the NCCN, and this is a voluntary organization where what they do is they assemble the information from various sources, both in the US and overseas, on a sort of instantaneous basis, and they start to exert what patterns they see. And that can tell you whether something should be a first-line cancer drug, that is, use it as your first shot, or whether it should be a second or third-line drug, all of which have the characteristics of being more powerful and more unpleasant. And then you take that information and you run it down, you get a perfectly organized system trying to deal with these sorts of risks. Very different from the FDA system. How do we know that it works? Well, there's something called an off-label use of a drug, and what you discover for serious injuries like for cancer, Once a drug is permitted to be used for one purpose, the majority of its uses are for other purposes in which there's no FDA approval. What happens is people say, well, this has been licensed for use for thyroid, but it may work for intestinal use or something of that particular sort. Let's give it a whirl and see how it goes. You report the response. Somebody else does it. And this is classic Hayekian knowledge. What happens is you have no systematic, formal, sort of double-blind clinical test with expected values. What you do is you just have lots of little bits of information which then get collated by voluntary organizations. And the huge battle in the United States is which of these two models, the formal clinical trial, which takes years to consummate, or this informal system generates more information. And I have no doubt that it turns out to be the second system which tends to outperform the first system. The number of difficulties that you face in trying to organize serious clinical trials, I can't go into a talk like this, but you can spend hours on trying to figure out how to put those things together, and you will make many mistakes. It also turns out that the professional guys who believe in clinical trials don't understand what expected value means. So what they do is they ask the question as to whether or not when you look at the sample of drugs, you can say on average with a 95% confidence rate that the drug is better than a placebo. So it's the two standard deviation test. Anybody else is asking a very different question, which is, I know I'm in very bad shape right now. Are my prospects better taking the drug than not taking the drug? And if you thought there was a 60% chance of improvement, you'll take that drug even if for 40% of the time it may be very bad, because you're likely to die in a very short period of time anyhow. So what you do is you see under the current system all the sophisticated people desperately asking for experimental exemptions from the way in which the drugs work. And why are they asking? Because they know how to multiply. And the folks at the FDA and who run clinical trials really have not done it. What they want is a gold standard which is inaccessible as opposed to an expected value standard which turns out to be probative. And you see the most incredible things, and let me just mention one case to you, and that's this recent drug which came out called Horizon. And this is one of the drugs which is used to control something called restless leg syndrome. And it may sound like a joke until it's your leg that starts wagging around compulsively under all circumstances. And this is a drug which was designed to allow you to take a single dose a day instead of multiple doses. For those of you who know anything about clinical pharmacology, this is a huge advance in terms of the reliability of the delivery system. And the FDA said, well, here's a drug that seems to have some promise, but we won't let it on the market because when we gave the dosage at 25 times the normal concentration in rats, they developed the kind of cancer that has never been developed in human beings. And so you try and figure out whether they got the expected value calculations right, and the answer is they just get them completely wrong. And so what you have to understand is if you don't understand the way in which risk and regulation come together, what you will do is always make systematic mistakes. Now, I've just about run out of my time, so I will just end with one little paradigm, which is the nuclear waste situation. In the United States, we have not built a nuclear plant since 1977, in part because we think the risks of nuclear power are greater than those of coal, when in fact, if you actually know the technology, as you can, it's much less. And we also have this problem of waste disposal. And it turns out the standard that you use for safe waste disposal in the United States is that you have to show that the place to which you're going to ship the waste will in fact remain impervious to any major geological event for a period of 100,000 years. So you assume that there is no technological improvement that will take place over that time span, and so you do it. And so they came up with a place called Yucca Mountain, which turns out to be located in the state of Harry Reid, who is the Senate Majority Leader. This is after 25 years, and Harry says it's not safe enough. You can't send the stuff here. Well, what do you do with all the stuff that's coming out of existing plants? Well, the answer is you leave it on site under circumstances where it's probably 1,000,000 times more dangerous than it would have been in Yucca Mountain, because either you shut down all nuclear plants or you have local storage. And again, time and time again, as you watch these characters go through risk analysis, they always seem to get it wrong. And what's my mechanism is you do not have to be a deep Hayekian. You do not have to be a deep believer in ordinal versus cardinal situations. What you have to understand in this business is if you learn how to multiply two numbers, most of what passes for risk analysis in these modern complicated situations gets everything backwards, so that all the delicate choices we had with respect to the criteria that I talked about in the beginning don't matter, because we have, through our collective devices, found our centralized authorities who managed to take the worst elements of every single one of the particular risk choices and put them together. And the cost of doing this are exceedingly high, because if you are stopping activities which are almost always good and never stopping activities that are particularly bad, what happens in the end is the injunction that you give in order to preserve safety ends up on balance in harming overall welfare. Now, I'm told by Joseph that we are both going to take Professor Steele and I questions from any of you if you have them. So you can come up to the microphone, ask me a question, or I'll ask you a question to get this thing going, so as to overcome the customary reticence of a Czech audience. But this is, of course, an international gathering. So thank you so much.
All right, so the floor is open for questions.
I have a question. Come on. This is my question, which is obviously intertemporal relationships with respect to a financial system are critical. But why is it that we would expect the price of money to vary from one time period to another in anything other than relatively modest fashion, as opposed to the thing that we talked about, the variation in prices of goods? So I would have thought, as a naive, sort of half Hayekian, I would guess that the real rate of interest is pretty much 2%. So if you control inflation, that's what it should be. Whereas the price of barley tomorrow relative to the price of barley today can vary all over the lot, so that I would expect real options on particular commodities to have a much higher variation. And when I listened to the talk, I wasn't sure whether money was treated like other commodities or whether it had a distinctive role.
Forgive me, but you asked a question first of all about the price of money, and then you started to elaborate into the price of credit, which is the rate of interest, which is a Keynesian fallacy. The price of money is not the rate of interest. The price of money is determined by the relative scarcity of money as against real commodities. Well, the intertemporal element is what the credit is a flow concept, money is a stock concept. When you're inquiring about the price of credit and they give you a rate of interest, you'd be wise to ask over what term is that interest payable. 5% per hour is a lot different from 5% per year. Okay. Well, an intertemporal price is how long? Yes. Holding constant default risk and exchange risk. Or if in a free market, by arbitrage, it would quickly close, the gaps would quickly close, and so there would be a uniform level. What that level would be in terms of the real productivity of investment opportunities and the willingness of people to be thrifty rather than to consume in the present. Please let me tell you about experts. This is from a cephalogist, David Butler, years ago. I have a very long question of citations, and this was the first. The function of the expert is not to be right more often than others, but to be wrong for more sophisticated reasons.
The function of the paid expert in legal situations is not only to be wrong, that's okay, but to be wrong for plausible reasons, right? And so essentially what you have to do in my profession is to figure out how far you can shade the truth until it becomes a lie. And it's actually very difficult, because the only comfort you take is that both experts who are taking opposite positions cannot be completely wrong in any given case. But the Central problem with experts is filtering them out to figure out which way it's more plausible. And there's a whole set of rules in the United States called the Daubert rules, which essentially designed to evaluate the pedigree of experts, which turn out to have their greatest relevance many times in these pharmaceutical cases, because causation, when you're talking about drugs, does not have a push-pull quality like it does with an automobile situation. And taking Vioxx and having heart attacks, in effect, is a lot more complicated than getting hit on the head by a brick and having a commotion. I mean, so you can see the differences. All right, so anyhow, that's my experts.
Well, I actually am from Chicago, so no, I was just wondering, you talked about the FDA approval rates and the processes for evaluation. Now, one knows that there is a big demand for drugs in the United States from Canada. It could be for all sorts of reasons. It could be price, it could be availability. Price is probably a large factor. But can you guesstimate to what extent this is playing a role? I mean, presumably the procedure for approving a drug to a Canadian market or indeed a European market are going to be different from the approvals of FDA.
That easily get confused. It's like making the mistake about money and credit, right? Stock and flow. There are two things that basically separate any national market from any other national market. One of them is that the approval rates that you get are never so vulgar as to be the approval rate for a drug. What happens is you get the approval rate to market Lipitor in 20 milligram tablets in the United States, and you get it to market 25 milligram stat tablets in Canada. And so one of the reasons why reimportation is difficult is if the approvals on the drugs don't match up perfectly, the Canadian property is now regarded as contraband when it comes into the United States. And indeed, you're talking about the so-called parallel importation problem. You buy something made in the United States, it gets sold in Canada, and then gets sold back in the United States at a cheaper time. One of the things that you have to do in order to make that go is to get the Canadian size approved in the United States, and there is now some legislation. One of the things that's particularly charming is they say the company which has to take the loss has to get the approval for the import to take place. That has not yet passed. So that's one thing. The second feature is a price feature. And drugs, of course, are an extremely complicated commodity because of what is, and this is both Austrian and standard economics, it's the marginal cost controversy all over again. Famous papers by Coase and Vickery in the late 1940s. And here's the marginal cost of drugs. Pill number one in the United States for a shiny new drug is today probably $1.3 billion. Right? And pill number two in the United States for the same drug is probably $2.50. So now, if you could find a sucker who's willing to pay $1.3 billion for the first tablet, you could then use marginal cost pricing for everybody else. But funny, we've yet to find this person who wants to pay that kind of money. So what you have to do in order to avoid the problem is to backload the cost of the first product onto all the subsequent units of the situation. At this point, if you think about it for a second, you have multiple markets in multiple nations with multiple uses, and then ask yourself, is there a uniqueness theorem which will tell you how much backloading you should give to every person or to every group of people? And the answer turns out to be no. Now what you do is you add in another element, which is in a place like Canada and in the EC, the European Union or Community, what you find out is there are often monopsony buyers. And what the monopsony buyer says is, listen, bozo the clown, we're going to pay you the marginal cost, so you're not going to be out of pocket, and we'll contribute some modest little amount to the fixed cost, but not very much if we can get away with it. So then all the fixed costs have to go somewhere else, and generally that place is the United States, from which many of these drugs originate because of our patent policy, for example. And we also have a very large market. Once that happens, you can see the one price theorem, that was one of the things you mentioned, right? What happens is you sell the thing to Canada, and you're selling it at $4 a unit, and you're selling it in the United States at $8 a unit. If the transactions cost for getting it back are less than $4, somebody's going to want to march it in, right, and buy it. So what happens is if you allow the parallel importation to take place, essentially you cannot recover your front-end capital costs, and so therefore nobody will make the drug at all. So there is in this country huge consumerist pressure to allow you to get closer to marginal cost, and huge producer pressure to allow you to recover the fixed cost from some of the wealthiest customers who you have. And the parallel importation issue, the Canadian stuff, has both of these things going together. And this third issue is the safety issue in a different way. When you get stuff coming out of Canada, this is the basic situation. They have a market of 25 million people. We have a market of 300 million people. That's roughly a 12-to-1 ratio. The Canadians are not very keen on giving their inspections for safety and production to the 95% or so stuff which is coming to the United States. And they have already announced they won't inspect it. So you get something that's coming out of Canada, you have no idea how that got into its blood supply or supply chain or what you're getting. And so I tell people, if you have any confidence in buying that stuff, what you better do is to go down to your local gasoline station and buy all your medicine there, because this stuff gets contaminated at a very high rate, and the number of ways that you could contaminate drugs, there are about 20 or 30 different ways that you can absolutely make a good drug into a bad drug. My favorite one is you just dilute it a little bit. It's an anesthetic. It comes in from Canada. And sure enough, it's one of these fraudulent diluted situations. And somebody wakes up in the middle of an operation because you haven't given sufficient strength to it. This has been known to happen already. So the cross-border stuff is exceedingly complicated.
Right, just a tiny adjoiner though. I take the point about the cross-border, but I was more interested in the way in which the different rules are made. So when you talked about the 20 milligrams and 25 milligrams, and one is approved there, one is approved there, the classic Chicago rejoinder would be, surely that could be endogenous, in the sense that that could be actually a part of the pharmaceutical company's policy to actually have it approved at different rates so that there isn't the seepage of the markets and you can do all that recovering. And I'm just wondering whether that's the case or whether the FDA really makes it exogenously 20 in the US.
It is such a hard question, but I would say on balance, the pressures from non-pharmaceutical sources to alter the approval process are at least as strong as those of the drug companies with respect to the same issues. Generally speaking, you as a drug company have an option to present your trials on whatever thing that you want without FDA approval. Theirs is the power to reject, yours is the power to present. But if you get a sense that a certain frequency is going to provoke citizen objectors to the thing and make it more difficult, you will do this. And so a lot of times what happens is you will listen to physician advice in the two countries, and if the kind of received wisdom in this country is that one dosage from the experimental trial seems to be better than another, you'll do it. And if in another place they have different protocols, it will go the other way around. I don't think on the dosage issue that there's a conspiratorial story that's particularly effective. I think that comes out in other ways.
I guess unfortunately our time is up. We have a party starting in 1 hour and we have to get ready. So thank you for your today's attendance. Thank you, gentlemen, for your wonderful lectures. Tomorrow we are meeting here. This panel sessions which will be here in the classroom are starting at 9 o'clock, and we have the whole day of 3 parallel sessions. So thank you for coming to Prague, and those who are joining us for dinner will be meeting here in an hour with the rest of the group tomorrow